Well, tell me the story, Dad. You know I want to hear it all. What was our tribal people like?
Our band was of the Big River tribe. The band was called Pera.
Gosh, that's a long name, Dad. I don't think I can even say it.
Yeah, it's long all right. Anyway, our band had the best tracks of all. Way back before the giant fish came and ate the land to make what is now known as Bass Strait. Our tribe had the only ochre mine of all the tribes. Yes, we had a big mine somewhere on Cradle Mountain, and the other tribes would trade with us for the ochre. One day, the Oyster Bay tribe was trading with the Big River mob when an argument started over who owned the ochre. The Oyster Bay fellas wanted more ochre, and for no cost. Well, while the leaders are right into the argument, a young fella from the Oyster Bay mob sneaks around the back of everyone and steals a big lump of red ochre. Oh, the Big River mob went mad when they seen what was happening and gave chase quick smart. This fella was real fast and they couldn't catch him. The fastest of the Big River runners were able to keep him in sight, but they couldn't keep up to him.
But Dad, surely a lump of ochre wouldn't be that important.
Oh, yes it would. That lump of red ochre was all that was left from the mine, and it was very important because it could multiply if broken into smaller lumps and thrown onto the ground. Well, that lad ran all over the Big River tribal lands, even as far as the Ben Lomond tribal lands. He was breaking off little pieces of ochre and dropping it, hoping that his pursuers would stop to pick the pieces up. He was hoping to slow them down, but it did leave a trail of ochre all over the place. Anyway, he finally found a way out of the Big River lands and led his chasers all over the north of the island, still breaking off pieces of ochre to drop as decoys. So, after a while, he can see he's almost out of ochre, and still they chase him. So he runs in a circle and back into the Big River land. In fact, where he ran through into the big country is now known as St. Peter's Pass. He jumped into Lake St. Clair and swam around in the deep water until eventually the Big River Spirit, Warrawa, turned him into a freshwater crayfish as punishment for stealing the ochre. Anyway, there was now ochre all over the North People's land, and as the rain came, the ochre grew to be new ochre mines. Ballawinne, our old people called it, means red ochre. Now the northern tribes had their own ochre and could trade with the southern tribes for all sorts of things.
Pity about the fellow who stole the ochre. But it did help a lot of people get some ochre, didn't it, Dad?
Yep, it sure did. Our ancestors left us with two important things because of the ochre being stolen. That's the ochre, of course. And now we can get crayfish from all the creeks that run into Bass Strait.
Yeah. Come on, Dad. Let's drive up to that creek outside of Penguin and catch a feed of crays to take home to Mum. You know she loves them.
Okay.
Menelagata, Ballawinne, Koitinena, Yatawacha. Now this area here is the Lake St Clair area, Lake St Clair itself, where the story of Ballawinne or Red Ochre is about. The story is very important because it not only tells the story of the past, but it also presents a picture of Aboriginal people today, so that you will see Aboriginal people today actually telling the story. And of course we aren't always the same as we were back in times before white people came here. So many people in our community have light skin, blonde hair, blue eyes.
Tell me the story, Dad. You know I want to hear it all.
So the story is very important in that we want people to understand that there's an Aboriginal community here today, still use our ochre. We still use ochre in many ceremonies. We've used them importantly in ceremonies such as the reburials of our ancestors that we've had returned to our community from museums and other institutions. And we've used ochre in happier ceremonies such as when we have cultural cook-ups and cultural get-togethers. So the ochre itself reminds us of our Aboriginality and our responsibilities to our land.
But Dad, surely a lump of ochre wouldn't be that important.
Oh, yes, it would. That lump of red ochre was all that was left from the mine. And it was very important because it could multiply if broken into smaller lumps and thrown onto the ground.
It starts off by letting the audience know it's from Tasmania, it's a story from Tasmanian Aboriginal people. It's done the part that I wanted in introducing two fair-skinned Aboriginal people at the start of the story so that we get rid of the stereotyping and start to understand our living community today. And then those two, the older fellow tells his daughter the story of their ancestors. It's a sort of a spiritual, cultural story. It's as it should be from Legends and Landscapes. Well, that's what it's about, Legends and Landscapes, and I think that fits in pretty well as an educational tool. In particular, I think about Tasmanian Aboriginal people, our history and how we relate to some things that people don't know about. I think that will be fairly well accepted by our community anyway, and that way I'm sure it'll be accepted across the country. The important thing about red ochre is that firstly our women were the only ones who would get ochre from the ochre mines and pass it on to our men, who would then trade with the red ochre. Generally speaking, men use the red ochre in their hair, and you'll see in the story that our men have all got red hair. That's because the ochre has been put in their hair and made ringlets of it. So my kind of hair would hang down with the red ochre in it and make very hard ringlets, and that is the traditional use of it by men in their hair. But we use it for markings over our body, including hand prints on your body, like a hand stencil, and those sorts of uses during ceremonies and certain activities that would be carried out on a daily basis, including hunting and dancing and whatever it might be. Now, Lake St Clair is a very important part of this story because it's one of the big lakes that feeds waterways all over the area. And when this young black fellow rushed off with this ochre and finished up having to get away from those who was chasing him, he had to head out in the middle of this lake here. And the old Warrawa, Ria Warrawa spirit came up and changed him into a crayfish a freshwater crayfish. And then when he could sneak away from those other men that was chasing him, he got out into those creeks that go up north into Bass Strait, and that's where you will find freshwater crayfish around our island now, and no other places. So in part you've learned how ochre has become such an important part of our culture, and how the crayfish came into being, because the crayfish was naughty and buzzed off with the ochre as a human and turned into a crayfish. And if you cook a crayfish, he turns red.